An unexpected contract, the secretary who became her millionaire boss's wife. Before we start the story, leave a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. Alice Martins was late. Again. She rushed down the sidewalk, heart pounding, holding a coffee cup in one hand and her phone in the other, trying to unlock the screen with the tip of her nose since her hands were full. "Oh no, oh no, oh no," she muttered, skillfully dodging a lamppost and an elderly woman with a shopping cart. The Scott Enterprises building loomed ahead, tall, modern, and gleaming. Her heart pounded even harder. This interview was her last chance to land a decent job and pay her overdue bills. She picked up her pace, determined to be on time, when, bam, Alice crashed into something solid. No, not just solid. It felt like a brick wall wearing an expensive suit. Her coffee went flying. She heard a short gasp, which was definitely not hers, of course, and time slowed as she watched the brown liquid soar through the air before landing right on a man's chest. Silence. The man looked down at the stain on his suit. Then at Alice. Alice looked back at him. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with sharp gray eyes. His face looked like it had been sculpted by gods who knew exactly what they were doing. But at that moment, his expression was more like, "I'm about to call my lawyer and sue you." Before he could say a word, Alice switched to emergency justification mode. "Okay, first of all, this was clearly your fault." The man blinked, stunned. "My fault?" Alice pointed at the ground. "Yes, you were standing right here, right in my way. Like a walking obstacle. I tried to move, but you didn't help." And she noticed his eyes narrowing and quickly changed her approach. "Or maybe it was the coffee's fault." "Yes, the coffee. Because you see, these cups are super slippery, and I heard that baristas sometimes use defective lids." The man crossed his arms, unimpressed. "Interesting theory. Thank you. I have a few more if you'd like to hear them." "I wouldn't." Alice let out a nervous laugh, trying to lighten the mood. "Look on the bright side. Now your suit has a unique touch. You just started the chick spilled coffee trend. Very exclusive." The man took a deep breath, rubbed his face, clearly trying not to strangle her, and then stepped forward. "I don't have time for this, and next time try not to turn strangers into modern art." He shot her one last deadly look before walking off. Without another word, he disappeared into the building's lobby, moving like a king disappointed with his subjects. Alice stood there, frozen, feeling her soul leave her body. Great Alice, first disaster of the day successfully completed. Then it hit her. Oh no! The interview! She turned and ran into the building for her job interview. She kept repeating to herself that nothing could go wrong now. A few minutes later, the receptionist called her. "Mr. Scott is expecting you. You can go up." Alice followed the directions to the designated floor, trying to calm her nerves. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared her for what happened when she entered the meeting room. There he was, the coffee man, the man whose suit she had turned into a walking frappuccino, and he was sitting behind an imposing desk, looking straight at her with an expression that said he had seen worse things, but hadn't expected to see them again so soon. Alice felt her legs turn to jelly. This can't be David Scott, the CEO of Scott Tech, the owner of the company, and now, officially, the man who had every reason in the world to send her out the door. David crossed his arms, clearly amused by the situation. "So, you're here for the secretary position?" Alice wanted to disappear. "Have a seat, Miss Martins. Let's begin." Alice sat down so quickly that she nearly missed the chair. David casually flipped through a file. The silence was unbearable. Alice wanted to dig a hole and jump in. "From what I see, your resume is very good. But tell me, Alice, why do you think you should be my secretary?" Alice felt a cold sweat. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Miss Martins? How was she supposed to answer that after what had just happened? She took a deep breath, trying to sound professional. "Well, I am efficient, very efficient, and organized." And she paused for dramatic effect. "I don't usually spill coffee on my bosses." Silence filled the room. Then, to her surprise, David smiled. It was quick, almost imperceptible, but it was there. She continued, "I'm highly organized, proactive, and I work well under pressure." David raised an eyebrow. "You work well under pressure?" Alice immediately realized she had said the wrong thing. He glanced at his still-stained shirt and then back at her. She wanted to disappear. "Well, maybe not under all kinds of pressure," she muttered, wringing her hands in her lap. David tapped his fingers on the desk, thinking, "Why do you want this job?" She tried to maintain her professional posture. "Because I'm competent and I know I can contribute to the company." He kept looking at her. "And because you desperately need the money, right?" Alice's eyes widened. "What? Of course not." David turned another page in the file. "You have a history of short-term jobs, late bill payments, and if I'm not mistaken, an eviction notice was sent to your apartment last week." The blood drained from Alice's face. "How do you know that?" He gave a small, knowing smile. "I run background checks." "That's illegal. Not if you have good lawyers." Alice had to bite her tongue to keep from saying something she'd regret. David set the file down on the desk and folded his hands together. He turned around and ran into the building for his job interview. She kept repeating in her mind that nothing could go wrong now. A few minutes later, the receptionist called her. "Mr. Scott is expecting you. You can go up." Alice walked to the indicated floor, trying to calm her nerves. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared her for what happened when she entered the meeting room. There he was, the man from the coffee shop, the guy whose suit she had turned into a walking frappuccino. And he was sitting behind an imposing desk, looking straight at her with an expression that said he had seen worse but hadn't expected to see it again so soon. Alice felt her legs turn to jelly. This can't be David Scott, the CEO of Scott Tech, the owner of the company, and now, officially, the man who had every reason in the world to kick her out. David crossed his arms, clearly amused by the situation. "So you're here for the secretary position?" Alice wanted to disappear. "Take a seat, Miss Martins. Let's begin." She sat down so abruptly that she almost fell off the chair. David flipped through a file slowly. The silence was torturous. Alice wanted to dig a hole and crawl into it. "From what I see, your resume is very good. But tell me, Alice, why do you think you should be my secretary?" Alice broke into a cold sweat. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Miss Martins? How was she supposed to answer that after what had just happened, she thought. She tried to compose herself and speak professionally. "Well, I'm efficient, very efficient, and organized." And she paused dramatically. "I don't usually spill coffee on my bosses." Silence filled the room. Then, to her surprise, David smiled. It was quick, almost imperceptible, but it was there. And then she continued, "Well, I'm very organized, proactive, and I work well under pressure." David raised an eyebrow. "You work well under pressure?" Alice instantly realized she had said the wrong thing. He glanced down at his still-stained shirt, then back at her. She suddenly felt like crying. "Well, maybe not under all kinds of pressure," she muttered, wringing her hands in her lap. David tapped his fingers on the table, thoughtful. "Why do you want this job?" She tried to maintain a professional posture. "Because I'm competent, and I know I can contribute to the company." He kept staring at her. "And because you desperately need the money, right?" Alice's eyes widened. "What? Of course not." David turned another page of her resume. "You have a history of short-term jobs, late bill payments, and, if I'm not mistaken, an eviction notice was sent to your apartment last week." The blood drained from Alice's face. "How do you know that?" He smirked. "I run background checks." "That's illegal." "Not if you have good lawyers." Alice had to bite her tongue to stop herself from cursing. David set the resume down on the desk and clasped his hands together. He held Alice's waist and pulled her closer. "I think this problem is already solved." Alice froze. "We're engaged." If she weren't standing in the middle of a crowd, she would have choked on her own breath. "What?" The board members exchanged surprised glances. "Really? Really?" David confirmed, his expression perfectly neutral. Alice stared at him, waiting for some clue that this was a joke. But when their eyes met, she realized something terrible. He was serious. Alice blinked, looking at David as if he had just announced he was an alien from another planet. "What?" Her voice came out strained. "We're engaged," David repeated with unsettling ease. Alice let out a short laugh, expecting someone to yell, "Gotcha!" But no one did. The board members looked pleased, and David remained as cold and calculating as ever. She glanced down at his hands on her waist, her mind refusing to process what was happening. "Sorry, I think my hearing just stopped working for a moment. Did you say engaged? As in marriage, together, forever? That kind of thing?" David smirked slightly, as if enjoying her confusion. No need to exaggerate the forever part. Alice made a strange noise, somewhere between a hysterical laugh and a gasp. I've barely worked here for 2 weeks, and now we're engaged? Are you sure you didn't hit your head? Trust me, I'm perfectly fine. Well, I'm not, she whispered through gritted teeth. The board members stepped away, satisfied with the explanation. One of them, an older man with a white mustache, patted David on the back. Wonderful news. A stable marriage will strengthen your image, Scott. We'll be expecting an invitation to the wedding. Alice felt pure panic rising in her chest. Her? Engaged to David Scott? The cold, calculating CEO she had turned into a walking coffee disaster? David waited until everyone was out of earshot before finally letting go of her waist. I think that was convincing enough. Alice folded her arms, still in shock. Convincing? Have you lost your mind? You just announced our engagement to the entire executive board. And it worked. Worked? Alice repeated, stunned. It worked for you. Meanwhile, I almost had a heart attack in public. David sighed and adjusted his tie, looking completely unbothered. We need to talk. He took her arm and led her to a more private corner of the room. Alice's legs felt shaky, as if she had just stepped off a roller coaster without a seatbelt. Before you have another panic attack, let me explain. David began. Alice took a deep breath and crossed her arms, preparing herself for the most absurd explanation in history. The board is pressuring me to show more personal stability. They think a single CEO gives off an irresponsible image that could hurt the company's interests. And your solution was dragging me into this madness? It was the most logical option. Alice scoffed. Logical? Logical for who? In what world does proposing to your assistant sound like a reasonable solution? David watched her patiently, as if waiting for her to finish her outburst before continuing. You need money. Alice froze. What? I know your mother is sick. I know you work hard to support your family. This arrangement would benefit both of us. Alice felt her face heat up. How did he know that? She had never talked about her personal life with him. That's incredibly intrusive, you know? David shrugged. I'm a businessman. I need to know who I'm working with. Alice blinked, still trying to process the shock. So you want me to pretend to be your fiancé? A fake marriage? Exactly. For 6 months. After that, we separate and go back to our normal lives. And what do I get out of this? David gave a small smile, as if he had been expecting that question. Besides a very high salary and generous benefits, I'll cover all of your mother's medical expenses. Alice's heart pounded. 6 months. Enough money to take care of her mother and secure a better future for her sister. But a fake marriage with David Scott? She rubbed her forehead, already feeling a headache coming on. This is completely insane. Maybe, but it's a good deal. Alice studied him for a few seconds. Did this man really see nothing beyond business? She let out a long sigh. And if someone gets suspicious, we'll make it convincing. A chill ran down Alice's spine. What do you mean, convincing? David met her gaze. We'll live together. What? He remained unfazed. We need to look like a real couple. Dinners, public appearances, events, and of course, you'll move into my house. Alice's eyes widened. That wasn't part of the deal. It is now. But what if I say no? David leaned in slightly, his gaze intense. Do you want to say no? Alice opened her mouth, then closed it. Damn it. He knew she needed this money. He knew that, as absurd as it was, this was her best option. Alice rubbed her temples, overwhelmed with confusion. I need time to think. David nodded, as if he had already expected that response. You have 24 hours. Alice spent the night wide awake. She tossed and turned in bed, trying to list the pros and cons of this insanity. Pros: enough money to pay the bills, helping her mother. A short contract, only 6 months. Okay, maybe the fact that David was ridiculously handsome was a small bonus. Cons: everything. Absolutely everything. The next day, with dark circles under her eyes and in a terrible mood, Alice walked into David's office. He watched her calmly, waiting. Alice sighed and crossed her arms. I have a condition. David raised an eyebrow. What is it? No emotional involvement. He gave a small, amused smile. I thought that was already obvious. Alice rolled her eyes. And one more thing. If at any point I want to walk away, I can. David studied her for a moment before responding. Deal. He extended his hand. Alice looked at his outstretched palm and felt a knot in her stomach. Her brain was telling her to run, but her financial problems were screaming louder. So, Before she could change her mind, Alice shook his hand. Deal. And just like that, she had traded her sanity for a fake marriage contract. What could possibly go wrong? Alice still couldn't believe what she was doing. That morning, she had woken up in her tiny apartment, sipped cold coffee, and spent a few minutes staring at the signed contract on the table. And now, she was standing at the entrance of David Scott's luxurious apartment, holding a suitcase and trying not to panic. "Welcome to your new home," David announced, his voice as composed as ever. Alice looked around, feeling like she had stepped into the pages of an architecture magazine. The apartment was huge, modern, and spotless, the complete opposite of her messy life. "My goodness, this looks like a five-star hotel." David took off his jacket and tossed it onto the sofa, ignoring her excitement. "I don't spend much time at home. Work takes up most of my time." Alice put her hands on her hips, taking in the space. "And here I thought rich CEOs spent their days sipping champagne and laughing." David gave her a blank look. "That's a common misconception." Alice smirked. "I bet you have a butler named Alfred hiding somewhere." David sighed. "Come on, I'll show you the room." Alice followed him, still trying to process the idea that she would be living there for the next 6 months. He opened a door, revealing a spacious guest room with a massive bed and a panoramic view of the city. "Here it is." Alice's eyes widened. "Wow, my entire old apartment could fit inside this room." "I'm glad you like it," he said, emotionless. "Oh, and one important rule, respect my privacy." Alice crossed her arms. "Don't worry, I have no interest in spying on your secret business meetings." David sighed. "Great. Now, as we discussed, we need to look like a convincing couple. We'll have to go out together, attend events, and act like we're in love when others are around." Alice forced an overly dramatic smile. "Oh, darling, I can't wait to spend the rest of my life by your side." David simply raised an eyebrow. "That was terrible. Sorry if my acting isn't Oscar-worthy." David closed his eyes, as if reconsidering his decision. "Tomorrow we have a dinner with some board members. You'll need an appropriate dress." Alice smiled. "Great, we can go to the mall." David looked offended by the suggestion. "I don't shop at malls." "Oh, you really have it tough." He ignored her and picked up his phone. "I'll have a stylist come over tomorrow. They'll bring a few options." Alice's eyes widened. "I get to try on designer dresses? This is a dream." David watched her, unimpressed. "Don't get used to it." The next day, Alice spent 3 hours trying on ridiculously expensive dresses. She twirled in front of the mirror while the stylist frowned and said things like, "This one highlights your posture, but it doesn't scream sophistication." David, on the other hand, looked completely bored, scrolling through his phone while she walked around. "This one or this one?" she asked, holding up 2 dresses. He looked up, glanced at them for half a second, and replied, "The black one." Alice narrowed her eyes. "You didn't even look properly. Black is classic. You always go for the easiest choice, don't you? It's called efficiency." Alice rolled her eyes but ended up picking the black dress. Hours later, Alice was standing next to David in an upscale restaurant. She tried to ignore the fact that she was surrounded by millionaires holding wine glasses that probably cost more than her entire life. David maintained perfect posture as he spoke with the executives. Alice did her best to smile and play the role of a loving fiancé, but her mind was focused on something else. He never truly smiled. David always had that controlled expression, as if he was always one step ahead. So she had an idea. She waited for the right moment, picked up her glass, and looked directly at him. "To the love of my life," she announced, loud enough for everyone to hear. David froze. The executives smiled, pleased with the display. Alice continued, "From the moment we met, I knew he was the one." David tightened his grip on his glass. "Alice," but she didn't stop. "I will never forget the day we first met, such a magical romantic moment." David shot her a sharp look. Alice smiled. "That moment when I spilled coffee on him, and he looked at me like he wanted to fire me. That's when I knew it was forever." The executives laughed, charmed. David closed his eyes and took a deep breath. "Do you really have to tell that story?" "Of course. It's the start of our fairy tale." David took a sip of his wine, probably regretting ever making this deal. On the drive back, he finally broke the silence. "If you do that again, I'll double your contract to a year." Alice laughed. "You should be thanking me. I made it all more believable." David glanced at her from the corner of his eye. If convincing means embarrassing, then yes. Alice leaned back in her seat, pleased with herself. But as she looked at him, something nagged at her. "Can I ask you something?" David sighed. "As if I could stop you. Why did you really agree to this fake marriage?" He was silent for a moment, as if considering his answer. "Business." Alice frowned. "Just that?" He looked away. "Just that." Alice sensed there was more to it, but for now she decided not to push. The car pulled up in front of the apartment. David got out first, but before Alice could step out, he extended his hand. "After all, we're a couple, aren't we?" She hesitated for a second, but took his hand, and for the first time, she felt something different when she touched him. Alice collapsed onto the apartment couch, kicking off her shoes with a long sigh. "I deserve a raise." David, loosening his tie nearby, raised an eyebrow. "You're already being paid very well." "Yes, but you never mentioned I'd have to become an actress in the process." He sat in the armchair across from her, picking up a glass of whiskey. "What do you mean?" Alice stared at him, incredulous. "Seriously? I had to make a fake toast about our eternal love. I almost recited a poem about your icy beauty." David took a sip of his whiskey, his expression unchanged. "And it worked." Alice rolled her eyes. "You have an incredible ability to ignore the chaotic part of the situation." He just shrugged. "It's a natural talent." Alice crossed her arms and watched him for a moment. Something about him unsettled her. David was always so controlled, so cold. But sometimes, when he thought no one was watching, he seemed different. More human. She remembered the way he had taken her hand that night, how he hadn't hesitated to guide her through the restaurant, and most of all, the way he looked at her when he thought she wasn't noticing. That made her stomach turn. "Have you always been like this?" David glanced toward the window. "Like what?" "So, robotic." He let out a low, humorless chuckle. "Robotic?" Alice shrugged. "Do you ever let yourself relax? Do something just because you want to, not because you have to." David was quiet for a moment, studying her. Then he simply said, "That doesn't interest me." Alice opened her mouth to argue, but he stood up. "Good night, Alice." And he left, leaving her with a strange feeling in her chest. Let's have some fun with people who only read the comments. Type McDonald's in the comments. Only those who made it this far will understand. Now, let's continue the story. The next morning, Alice walked into the kitchen and found David already dressed, reading the newspaper like an 80-year-old man. "You actually read a physical newspaper?" she teased, grabbing a cup of coffee. "I like the habit." Alice sat at the table watching him with curiosity. "You know what this apartment is missing?" David looked up. "What? Life." He blinked, confused. "What do you mean?" Alice gestured around. "Everything is so cold. There's nothing here that shows who you are. No pictures, no mess, not even a comfortable couch. This is how I like it. No, this is how a robot likes it." David sighed and folded the newspaper. "You really need to stop calling me a robot." Alice smiled. "I'll think about it." Before he could respond, his phone rang. David answered, and his face turned serious. "Yes, I'll be there soon." He hung up and stood up. "I need to go to the office. Want to come with me?" Alice frowned. "You never invite me to anything at work." "We're engaged. We need to be seen together." Alice sighed. "Sure. Let's pretend a little longer." When they arrived at Scott Tech, Alice noticed something strange. Normally, David walked through the office like a medieval king, ignoring the peasants. But now, something was different. People were looking at her, whispering, looking at David, then back to her. Alice felt a knot in her stomach. "Okay, what's going on? Why is everyone looking at me like I'm an alien?" David sighed. "There's a story in the press about our engagement." Alice's eyes widened. "What?" It was expected. She grabbed her phone and quickly typed in the browser. There it was, the headline. "Cold and calculating David Scott shocks everyone and announces engagement to his assistant." Alice read through it frantically. "They called me unassuming. Is that an insult?" David glanced over his shoulder. "It depends." "Depends?" she huffed. "And they even included a quote from my toast." Alice Martins declared her love at a romantic dinner. She hid her face in her hands. "I'm going to need a new identity, maybe a fake passport." David ignored the drama. "Let's go. We have a meeting." Alice followed him, feeling everyone's eyes on her. When they entered the meeting room, David changed. His expression became even colder and more focused. He sat at the head of the table and began discussing business with the precision of a surgeon. Alice noticed something. This was how he protected himself. Behind that perfect exterior, there was something more. And for some reason, she wanted to find out what it was. That night, after a long day of meetings and strange looks at the office, Alice flopped onto the couch. David arrived shortly after, loosening his tie. She looked at him and smiled. "Want to watch a movie?" David raised an eyebrow. "A movie?" "Yes, something light. A rom-com." David scoffed. "I don't watch that kind of thing. You need to broaden your horizons." Before he could escape, Alice grabbed the remote and started the movie. David rolled his eyes but sat down next to her. At first, he seemed bored, but then something curious happened. During a particularly funny scene, David laughed. Not a quiet laugh, a real laugh. Alice looked at him, surprised. "Oh my God, you laughed." He immediately stopped and cleared his throat. It was a reflex. "No, it was a laugh, a real laugh. We need to document this moment." She grabbed her phone and pretended to take notes. Historic day. David Scott laughed. The miracle happened. David rolled his eyes, but he was still smiling. Alice felt her heart beat differently. Something was changing, and she wasn't sure if she was ready for it. Alice was starting to get used to the idea of being David Scott's fake fiancée. Well, getting used to it might be an exaggeration. She still wondered how on earth her life ended up at this point, but at least the perks were good. A luxury apartment, expensive clothes, and extravagant dinners. The problem? David himself. He kept being the same controlling, serious CEO he always was. But lately, something had changed. He seemed more attentive, like he was watching Alice more often, noticing little details he used to ignore. And that was scary, because she was starting to notice things about him too. But Alice decided it was just a side effect of the fake marriage, nothing more than that. At least, that's what she thought. The company organized a luxurious charity event, and as the loving couple, Alice and David had to attend together. Alice wore a stunning red dress that had been picked out by a stylist. "You look beautiful." David's voice was casual, but Alice almost choked on her own saliva. "What?" He adjusted the cuffs of his shirt. "I said you look presentable." Alice rolled her eyes. "First rule for compliments: try to sound sincere." David let out a tired sigh. "You want me to be sincere?" She crossed her arms. "Of course." He slowly stepped closer, his eyes scanning every detail of the dress. Alice felt her heart race. "You look really beautiful," he said finally. She swallowed hard. Thank you?" David smirked. Was that convincing enough? Alice wanted to punch him. The event was full of important business people and influential figures. Alice tried to look elegant and sophisticated, but the truth was she felt out of place in this world of rich people. And then, the unexpected happened. "Alice?" She turned around and her stomach dropped. There, among the guests, was Lucas, her ex-boyfriend, the guy who broke her heart years ago and whom she hadn't seen since. He smiled. "Wow, it's really you." Alice blinked, feeling her brain freeze. "Lucas?" David, who had been talking to a nearby investor, noticed the situation and immediately walked over. His eyes assessed Lucas with surgical precision. "Who is this?" Alice opened her mouth, but Lucas was faster. "I'm Lucas, Alice's ex-boyfriend," he said, extending his hand to David. David didn't shake it. He just crossed his arms and looked at Lucas with a cold stare. "Interesting." Alice could feel the tension in the air. Lucas smiled, unaware of the danger. "I never thought I'd run into Alice here. By the way, I'm surprised to see her at an event like this." Alice narrowed her eyes. "What does that mean?" "Nothing, just that." "This isn't really your kind of world, right?" David frowned. Lucas continued. "So how did you two meet?" Alice opened her mouth to answer, but David was quicker. It was love at first sight. Alice's eyes went wide. Lucas laughed. "Really?" Because Alice never really seemed like the type to believe in that kind of thing. David smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. "Well, people change. And Alice and I are inseparable now." Alice felt a strange chill. There was something different about David's tone. And then it happened. David pulled Alice by the waist and placed a firm, possessive kiss on her lips. Alice froze. Her body stiffened. Her mind short-circuited. Lucas widened his eyes, and for a moment, the whole world disappeared. The kiss wasn't fake. It wasn't just acting. There was something about it that felt too real. When David pulled away, Lucas cleared his throat, uncomfortable. "Well, it was good seeing you, Alice." He left in a hurry. Alice was still out of breath. She looked at David, her face burning. What was that? David shrugged. Just making sure he got the message. Alice blinked, incredulous. Message? What message? That you're not available. Alice crossed her arms. Why does it feel like you were jealous? David laughed, humorless. Jealous? Don't be ridiculous. It's part of our contract. Alice watched him for a few seconds. Something didn't make sense. But before she could ask, someone called David, and he walked away. Alice stood there, her heart racing, a million questions in her head. That night, at the apartment, the silence was deafening. Alice crossed her arms. So, are we going to talk about this? David, who was taking off his jacket, looked at her confused. Talk about what? Alice pointed to his lips. About the kiss. David didn't blink. It was just part of the role. Alice scoffed. Seriously? Because it felt way too real to me. David gave a half smile. Did you like it? She choked. What? He stepped closer. Did you like the kiss, Alice? She opened and closed her mouth, feeling her face burn. Stop changing the subject, David smiled. Good night, Alice. He left the room, leaving her completely frustrated. Alice threw a pillow on the couch. Why is this man like this? She didn't know what was worse. The fact that David seemed untouchable, or the fact that, for the first time, she wished he wasn't. In the days after the unexpected kiss, Alice did everything she could to not think about it. She tried to convince herself it meant nothing, that it was just part of the contract. But every time her eyes met David's, that damn kiss came back to her mind. And the worst part? David was acting like everything was normal, as if nothing had happened. Which only made Alice even more frustrated, because if it was so easy for him to forget, why wasn't it that easy for her? On Friday morning, David walked into the office with a serious look on his face. We're traveling. Alice blinked. What? Where to? Something came up. I need to attend an important meeting and you're coming with me. Alice crossed her arms. Is this part of the contract too? David stared at her. Do you want to stay? She bit her lip. David Scott never asked questions like that. He gave orders, and in that moment, it seemed like he actually wanted to know if she wanted to go. Alice didn't know why, but she answered, I'll go. David nodded. Great, pack your things. The plane leaves in an hour. Alice blinked. A plane? Wait, does that mean we're to a luxury resort? Yes. Alice's mouth dropped open. You're taking me to a resort? Like a 5-star hotel with an infinity pool and expensive massages? David sighed. Yes, but it's a business trip. Alice didn't hear anything after luxury resort. This is amazing. I need a new bikini. David looked at her with no expression. You really didn't get anything I said. Alice smiled. Of course I did. You said, Alice, enjoy your paid vacation. David rubbed his temples. Let's go before I regret bringing you. The flight was quick, and when Alice got off at the resort, she was speechless. It was a tropical paradise with palm trees, white sand, and an infinity pool that seemed to touch the horizon. My God, I was born to live here. David ignored her excitement. We have a meeting in an hour. Alice rolled her eyes. Seriously? Can't you relax for a second? David stared at her. This is work, she sighed. Fine, robot boss. But after, I'm going to the pool. David didn't answer, but Alice could have sworn she saw the smallest smile on his face. The meeting went smoothly, and as promised, Alice ran to the pool as soon as it was over. She was lying on a lounge chair, enjoying a colorful drink when the sky suddenly darkened. This doesn't look good. A few minutes later, the wind started blowing hard, and the resort staff rushed to gather umbrellas and chairs. Alice didn't have time to run. The rain came pouring down from the sky like a giant bucket of water. She screamed and ran through the garden, trying to cover her head with her hands. Then a familiar voice caught her attention. Alice. She looked back and saw David, standing at the hotel entrance, completely dry and with his arms crossed. What are you doing out here? Alice huffed. What does it look like? Dancing in the rain? David sighed. Get inside. She ran in, soaked and shivering from the cold. That was a disaster. David watched her, his eyes slowly scanning her body. Alice felt her face heat up. What's wrong? He looked away. Nothing. It's just, you're soaked. Alice looked at herself. Her dress was clinging to her body, revealing more than it should. Great. Now I look like an extra from a 90s romantic movie. David chuckled softly. Alice stopped. Did you laugh? He cleared his throat. No. Alice smiled. You did. You liked my disaster. David turned his back. Go upstairs and change before you catch a cold. Alice rolled her eyes but obeyed. She didn't see when David looked back, his gaze lingering on her longer than it should have. A few hours later, the hotel reception called to let them know that the bad weather had knocked out a generator, and some rooms were without power. Alice and David were told they'd have to share a room. Great, David murmured. Alice's eyes widened. Share a room? With you? David sighed. Relax. It's not like I'm going to try anything, Alice huffed. Why do you say it like I'm not irresistible? David gave a half smile. Good night, Alice. The room was big and luxurious, but the problem was the huge single bed in the middle. Alice pointed at it. Hey, how are we going to solve this? David grabbed a pillow and tossed it on the couch. I'll sleep here. Alice raised an eyebrow. Wow, a real gentleman. David took off his jacket and started unbuttoning his shirt. Alice quickly looked away. What are you doing? David looked at her, confused. Taking off my shirt. You've seen a man without a shirt before, haven't you? Alice was silent. Because the truth was, David Scott without a shirt was a problem, a big one. She turned her back. Put on a t-shirt before I call the police. David laughed. Good night, Alice. She threw herself on the bed, pulling the covers up to her head. Good night. But the problem was, she couldn't sleep. Because his scent was all over the room. Because she knew he was just a few feet away. And because something inside her told her that tonight would change everything. In the middle of the night, Alice woke up to the sound of thunder. She sat up in bed and saw David awake on the couch. You didn't sleep? He sighed. I'm not used to sleeping away from home. Alice hesitated. Then she pulled the blanket and patted the bed. Come. David raised his eyebrows. What? Come. Just for a while. The couch doesn't look comfortable. He studied her for a few seconds, then slowly got up and sat on the edge of the bed. Alice held her breath. They were so close. She felt his warmth. She smelled him, and for the first time, David seemed vulnerable. His eyes dropped to her lips. Alice's heart raced. And then, David pulled away. That was a mistake. Alice felt a tightness in her chest. Why do you always say that? David didn't answer. He just got up and went back to the couch, and Alice stayed there, trying to ignore the feeling that she was starting to truly fall in love. The flight back home was quiet. Alice stared out the airplane window, trying to ignore the strange tightness in her chest since the night before. Since David almost kissed her. Since he pulled away and said it was a mistake. A mistake. She wanted to hate him for it. But she couldn't. Because if it really was a mistake, why was he looking at her like that now? David was on the other side of the cabin, reading a report as if nothing had happened. As if he wasn't confused. But Alice knew the truth. She knew him too well by now. And for the first time, David Scott wasn't in control of anything. Back at the apartment, Alice tried to go about her routine normally. But David was different. He wasn't cold like before. He was distant, which was worse. Because before, Alice knew he was closed off because he wanted to be. Now she saw a man struggling with something he didn't want to feel. And that deeply frustrated her. Because if he was confused, she was even more so. That night, Alice got out of the shower and found David sitting in the living room, staring at nothing. You look like a soap opera villain reflecting on your choices. He turned his gaze toward her and let out a tired sigh. I was just thinking. Alice flopped onto the couch, hugging a pillow. About what? David hesitated, then finally spoke. About us. Alice froze. She blinked a few times, trying to process. Us as in this fake marriage, or us as in you and me? David didn't answer. Which was answer enough. Alice felt her heart race. David, are you scared? He clenched his jaw. This is a contract, Alice, she huffed. Oh sure, because everything with you has to be a contract, a rule, an agreement. Do you want it to be more than that? Alice froze, because she didn't know how to answer. And David noticed that. He stood up, grabbed his jacket, and walked toward the door. I'll work in the office. Good night. Alice stayed there, trying to understand why that man was so impossible. And worse, why, even knowing that, she wanted him to stay so badly? In the following days, David kept pulling away. He came home late from work. He barely spoke. He avoided looking her in the eye. Alice tried to ignore it, but it hurt. Then, one morning, something changed. Alice woke up to a strange smell in the kitchen. She went downstairs and nearly had a heart attack. David was trying to make breakfast. The scene was disastrous. There was flour on the counter, broken eggs, and a toaster smoking. Alice almost laughed. "What are you doing?" David turned around, looking a bit lost. "Trying to make pancakes." Alice was in shock. "You? Cooking? What happened? Did the apocalypse come and I didn't get the memo?" David rolled his eyes. "I just thought it would be a nice gesture." Alice felt her heart soften, because David wasn't the type to make gestures. He wasn't the type to try. But for some reason he was trying. And that meant more than any words. She took a bite of the misshapen pancake. "Wow, this is awful." David crossed his arms. "No need to exaggerate." Alice smiled. But it was a sweet gesture. David looked away. Alice knew he hated feeling vulnerable. And for the first time, he was trying to show he cared, even if he didn't say it in words. A few days later, Alice woke up to several messages on her phone. It was her birthday. She went downstairs, expecting to find the house the same as always. But then she stopped midway, because there was a cake on the table and a gift next to it. She furrowed her brow. David was leaning against the counter, watching her. "You did this?" He shrugged. "The housekeeper made the cake, but the gift is mine." Alice carefully picked up the little box and opened it. Inside there was a delicate necklace with a small star-shaped pendant. Alice felt a lump in her throat. "David?" He seemed uncomfortable. "You keep saying you like to look at the stars, so I thought." Alice smiled, her eyes shining. "You remembered that?" David looked away. "Yes." Alice felt something strong in her chest, because it wasn't just a gift. It was proof that he was actually paying attention to her. She took a step forward and hugged him. David stiffened. But then, slowly, he hugged her back. And for a second, Alice wondered what it would be like if this wasn't just a contract, if it were real. That night, Alice looked at the gift again. She knew she was falling in love. And that was dangerous. Because David was still David. He was still the man who ran away from feelings. But what if he was feeling something too? What if he just didn't know how to deal with it? Alice didn't know the answer. But she knew she was about to find out. Alice was sure of one thing. David Scott was hiding something. It wasn't just the way he pulled away whenever things between them got more intense. There was something more. A fear. A block. And Alice was determined to find out what it was. The next morning, Alice was in the kitchen, drinking coffee, when Carmen, the housekeeper, appeared. Carmen had worked for David for years and was one of the few people who didn't seem to be afraid of him. Alice looked at her with a smile. "Carmen, tell me something. Has David always been like this?" Carmen raised an eyebrow. "Like what?" Alice sighed. "Closed off. Robotic. Hard to deal with." Carmen smiled. "He wasn't like that before." Alice's attention sharpened. "So something happened?" Carmen hesitated. "What I know is that David used to be more human, but something made him change." Alice felt a cold sensation in her stomach. Because now she was sure. David had a past he didn't want to share, and if Alice wanted to understand what was happening between them, she needed to figure out what it was. Alice spent the day thinking about the conversation with Carmen. Then she had an idea. She grabbed her laptop and started searching for information about David. She already knew the basics. Brilliant, cold CEO, a feared businessman in the corporate world, a committed bachelor. But when she dug deeper, she found something interesting. An old article about a scandal. Alice widened her eyes when she read the headline, "David Scott betrayed and publicly humiliated by his fiancée at the altar." What? She clicked on the link and started reading. Years ago, David was about to marry a woman named Isabella, a famous heiress. Beautiful, elegant, perfect. But on the day of the wedding, she ran off with another man. Alice felt a knot in her stomach. She looked at the photo attached to the article. David was standing there, in front of the empty altar, with a completely broken expression. Alice swallowed hard. So this was it. This was why he was so cold. He didn't want to get involved, because he knew what it was like to get hurt. Alice closed the laptop and ran her hands over her face. She understood now, but the problem was, what was she going to do with this information? That night, Alice went downstairs and found David sitting on the couch, drinking whiskey. She watched him for a moment. He looked tense, like he was carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. Alice took a deep breath and walked over to him. "Want to go out for dinner?" David looked at her, surprised. "Dinner?" She smiled. "Yes. A normal dinner. No meetings, no contracts, just the two of us." David seemed to hesitate, but then he nodded. All right. The restaurant was small and cozy. Alice and David sat at a table in the back, away from curious eyes. For the first time, they weren't playing roles. They were just being themselves. Alice noticed that David seemed more relaxed, and for the first time he looked comfortable. They talked about trivial things, movies, food, travel. Then Alice decided to take a chance. David, can I ask you something? He looked at her cautiously. Depends. Alice bit her lip. What happened to you? He frowned. What do you mean? She sighed. Why are you so afraid of getting involved? David was silent for a long moment. Then he finally spoke. Because I've been hurt before. Alice felt her heart tighten. Isabella. David stared at her, surprised. You researched me? She shrugged. I needed to understand you. David looked away. There's nothing to understand. I was an idiot. I believed in something that didn't exist. Alice bit her lip. Have you ever thought that maybe she didn't deserve you? David stayed silent, and for the first time, he seemed vulnerable. On the way home, the silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was full of something unsaid. When they got to the apartment, David stopped at the door of Alice's room. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said something that made her heart stop. You make me want to feel again. Alice's eyes widened, because for the first time, David was admitting that he felt something for her. And at that moment, Alice knew she was completely lost, because she felt it too, and for the first time, she didn't want to run from it. Alice spent the night awake. After what David said, you make me want to feel again, she couldn't run from the truth anymore. She was in love. Completely. Desperately. And for the first time in her life, that scared her. Because David Scott was a man who didn't allow himself to feel. He didn't give in. But what if it was different with her? What if he was starting to change? Alice needed to find out. And as crazy as it seemed, she decided she needed to take a chance. Let's play a little game with those who only read the comments. Type Coca-Cola in the comments. Only those who made it this far will understand. Now let's continue the story. The next morning, Alice gathered her courage. She found David in the kitchen, as always, impeccable and distant. But this time, she wouldn't let him pull away. We need to talk. David lifted his eyes from the newspaper, looking cautious. About? Alice took a deep breath. About us. He slowly lowered the newspaper. Alice, she raised a hand, stopping him from speaking. I need to say this, and please let me finish. David stayed silent, which on its own was a miracle. Alice continued. When this started, I thought it was just a contract, but at some point it turned into something else. She felt her heart race. I fell in love with you, David. Absolute silence. David froze. Alice had never seen him like this before. It was as if his mind had short-circuited. He opened his mouth, then closed it. And then he did the one thing Alice didn't expect. He stood up and walked out, without saying a word. Alice stood there, in shock. She expected anything. But not this. David just ran away. Like he didn't even have the courage to face her. She swallowed her tears. But she knew what she had to do. If David couldn't handle what she felt, then there was no reason for this fake marriage to continue. That night, Alice packed her bags. She took the signed contract and placed it on the table, along with the fake ring she wore. She didn't want to leave like this, but David wasn't giving her a choice. Before she left, she wrote a short note. You won, David. This time, it was you who left me at the altar, Alice. And then she left. When David got home and saw the note, his heart stopped. Alice was gone. He knew this would happen, but why did it feel like something inside him had broken? David didn't know what to do. The only thing he knew was that, for the first time, he missed someone. And that scared him more than anything. David had never felt that way before. The apartment was too quiet. Alice wasn't there anymore. And, for the first time in a long time, he felt a void he couldn't ignore. He stared at the contract on the table next to the ring Alice had left behind. Then his eyes fell on the note she had written. You won, David. This time, it was you who left me at the altar. The paper trembled in his fingers, because Alice was right. He ran. He fled. He did exactly what he spent years condemning others for doing. And now, she was gone. David didn't go to work that day. He spent hours in the apartment, not knowing what to do with the weight on his chest. The image of Alice leaving, bags packed, replayed in his mind. Her laugh, the way she teased him, how she seemed to see through the mask he wore every day. Then one question hammered in his mind. Why did he let her go? The pain of regret came unexpectedly. At first, David tried to convince himself that it was the right thing to do. He couldn't get involved. He shouldn't. But then, he realized something that hit him like a punch to the stomach. He was already involved. Alice had already become part of his life. And now that she was gone, nothing seemed to make sense anymore. He tried to go back to his routine as before. But he couldn't. The days passed slowly, dragging on, empty. The house was too big without her. Breakfast was too quiet, and every time he entered the guest room, he saw her absence stamped on every corner. David couldn't pretend anymore. He needed her. But would it be too late? On the third night without Alice, David finally admitted to himself he loved her, and that realization terrified him, because loving meant exposing himself. It meant allowing himself to be vulnerable, and throughout his life he refused to do that. But now he knew that, if he kept running, he would lose Alice forever, and that was a thought he just couldn't bear. David grabbed his phone and searched for Alice's number. But he hesitated before dialing. What would he say? That he'd made a mistake? That he couldn't live without her? That, for the first time in his life, he wanted more than contracts and rules? He didn't know how to say it, but he knew he had to try. He dialed the number, rang once, twice, 3 times, until her voice answered. Hello? David felt his heart race. He wanted to speak. He wanted to say everything that was stuck inside of him. But at the last second, he froze. Fear took over. The silence stretched on. David, Alice's voice sounded on the other end, hesitant. David closed his eyes, and then he hung up. Because he realized that it wasn't enough to just say something. He needed to prove it, and there was only one way to do it. The next day, David made a decision. He was going after Alice, no matter what it took. He needed to see her, to explain everything, to tell her he was an idiot, to tell her he loved her. David was never the type of man to chase someone, but for the first time in his life, he was willing to run after Alice. And this time, he wouldn't let her go. David never imagined he'd find himself in that position. He, the relentless CEO, the cold man who always kept everything under control, was about to do something completely crazy. He was going after Alice. And for the first time, he didn't have a plan. All he knew was that he couldn't let her go. Because now it was clearer than ever, he loved her. David spent days trying to deny the feeling. He tried to convince himself that it was for the best, that letting Alice go was the right thing to do. But everything felt wrong without her. The apartment was empty, the office was dull, even the coffee he drank every morning tasted bland. It was as if all the color had disappeared from the world. And then he realized. Alice wasn't just someone who had happened to enter his life. She was the only thing that made sense. And if he didn't do something now, he'd lose her forever. He spent the day trying to find her. He called her phone dozens of times, but Alice didn't answer. He sent messages. No reply. So, with no other option, he went to her old apartment. But Alice wasn't there. The only person he found was Clara, Alice's younger sister, who opened the door with an unfriendly expression. "What are you doing here?" Clara crossed her arms, staring at him suspiciously. David took a deep breath. "I need to talk to Alice." Clara rolled her eyes. "Oh, now you need to, huh? Where was this urgency when you broke her heart?" David felt a weight on his chest. "I made a mistake. I need to fix this." Clara studied him for a moment and let out an exasperated sigh. "Too late." David felt a chill down his spine. "What do you mean? Where is she?" Clara hesitated, but then answered, "She left." David's heart sank. "What? Where did she go?" Clara crossed her arms. "She went to get some time away. She said she needed to distance herself from everything, especially from you." David had never felt something so heavy inside, because now he knew. Alice was running from him, and if he didn't do something now, he might never see her again. David spent hours searching for clues about where Alice could be. He remembered a conversation they had months ago when she mentioned a small cabin by the beach where her family used to spend summers. It was a special place for her. And now it was the only clue he had. Without wasting any time, David grabbed the car keys and drove non-stop. If Alice was there, he would find her, and this time he wouldn't let her go. The road was long and silent. As he drove, David found himself thinking about everything that had happened. The day Alice came into his life, the moment she spilled coffee on him, the way she completely messed up his organized routine, and most of all, the way she made him feel alive again. David knew he had never felt anything like this before. And for the first time, he didn't want to run away. When he arrived at the cabin, it was already night. David parked the car and paused for a moment, gathering his courage. Because this time, he couldn't make a mistake. He got out of the car and walked up to the door, his heart pounding in his chest. And then he knocked. Seconds later, Alice opened the door. Her eyes widened when she saw him there. "David? What are you doing here?" He swallowed hard, feeling his throat dry. "I came to get you." Alice blinked, looking confused. "What?" David took a deep breath. He knew he couldn't back down now. "I was an idiot. I let you go because I was scared, but I can't ignore it anymore, Alice." She crossed her arms. "Ignore what, exactly?" David looked her in the eyes and for the first time said what he really felt. "I love you." Alice held her breath. She hadn't expected this. "You, what?" David stepped forward, his voice more confident. "I love you, Alice. I tried to deny it. I tried to run, but I can't." She still looked in shock. "David, you never showed that you felt anything." He closed his eyes for a second before saying, "Because I was scared." Alice stayed silent. Then, finally, she whispered, "And now?" David took her hands. "Now I want to be with you. For real. No contracts, no rules, no pretending. Just you and me." Alice felt tears welling up in her eyes, because even though she was hurt, she still loved him. She had always loved him. But would it be enough? She sighed. "David, I need to think." He nodded, even though the fear of losing her was consuming his chest. "I'll wait as long as it takes, but I won't give up on you." Alice felt her heart race, because for the first time, David was fighting for her. And maybe that was all she had ever wanted. Alice spent the night awake. Since David showed up at the cabin door and said those words she had dreamed of hearing for so long, her mind had been in a whirlwind. "I love you." She wanted to believe it. She wanted to say, "I love you too." But what if he ran away again? What if, at the first sign of vulnerability, David turned back into the cold, distant man she had known? Alice didn't want to go through that again. She didn't want to risk her heart being broken once more. So that morning, when David appeared on the porch holding 2 cups of coffee, she tried to act normal. "Good morning." She took the cup and murmured a "thank you," without looking directly at him. David sat down beside her on the porch and stayed quiet for a moment, as if trying to find the right words. "You're still mad at me." Alice took a deep breath. "I'm not mad, David." He raised an eyebrow. "Then why does it feel like you're 1 second away from kicking me out of here?" She finally looked at him. "Because I don't know what to believe." David put the cup on the table and turned fully toward her. "Believe what I'm telling you." Alice let out a low, humorless laugh. "You want me to just forget that you left me? That you ignored what I felt and ran away like I was a problem to be avoided?" David closed his eyes for a second, clearly affected by her words. "I was an idiot." Alice crossed her arms. "Yeah, I can agree with that." He sighed, running his hands through his hair. "Alice, I spent my whole life thinking it was easier not to feel anything. That it was better to keep my distance and avoid getting hurt. But then you showed up and messed everything up." She bit her lip, trying to ignore the tightness in her chest. "And your solution was to run away." David gently cupped her face, his eyes locked on hers. "My solution was to deny the obvious. But I can't do that anymore. I love you, Alice, and if I have to spend the rest of my life proving that to you, I will." Alice's heart raced. She wanted so badly to believe him. But what if he changed his mind again? What if one day he decided he wasn't capable of loving her anymore? David seemed to notice the fear in her eyes. "I've never been good at showing how I feel. But with you, I want to try." Alice felt her eyes fill with tears. She took a deep breath, trying to keep her voice steady. "I need time." David nodded, even though every part of him was begging her to say she would stay. "I'll wait as long as it takes." Alice looked at him for a long moment before whispering, "Then prove it to me." And for the first time, David understood exactly what he needed to do. David understood exactly what he needed to do. Alice didn't want empty promises. She didn't want just pretty words. She wanted proof. And this time, David was willing to give everything he had to show her it was real. That morning, he left the cabin and drove into town. Alice watched from the porch as he got in the car and disappeared down the road. He didn't say where he was going. And, as much as she tried to convince herself she didn't care, a part of her wondered what he was planning. The day passed slowly. Alice tried to distract herself with a book, but she couldn't focus on a single sentence. David didn't send any messages. He didn't call. And, for the first time since he came back into her life, she missed him. She missed him all the time, actually. But admitting that was a whole different story. When the sun started to set, Alice heard the sound of the car arriving. David got out and grabbed something from the trunk. Alice frowned. He had 2 suitcases. And when he finally got closer, she noticed the change in his expression. He looked lighter. "What's this?" she asked, pointing to the suitcases. David set one down on the ground and opened the other. Alice's eyes went wide. "What are you doing?" He pulled out a stack of papers and threw them on the porch floor. "I'm resigning." Alice froze. "What?" David looked her in the eyes. "I asked the board to accept my resignation. I'm no longer the CEO of Scott Tech." Alice couldn't believe what she was hearing. "You're kidding." He crossed his arms. "Do you think I would joke about something like this?" She shook her head, still in shock. But the company is your life." David gave a small smile. "It was." Alice felt a chill in her stomach. "And what are you going to do now?" He stepped forward and took her hand. "I'm staying here. With you." Her heart stopped for a second. "David," he cupped her face. "You wanted proof? Here it is." Alice blinked, still trying to process. "You gave up everything for me?" David nodded. "I gave up everything to finally live, and that means being with you." Alice felt the tears burn in her eyes, because for the first time, David wasn't running away. He was staying, and deep down she knew it was real. Alice never imagined her life would take such an unexpected turn. David, the man who had run from his feelings for so long, had chosen to stay. He gave up the empire he had built, his CEO position, the comfort of his calculated routine, just to prove that he loved her. And now, there on the porch of the cabin, with their fingers intertwined, Alice finally believed. But she had no idea what was coming next. In the days that followed, David seemed like a different man. He wasn't in a hurry. For the first time, he was living without a schedule, without contracts, without the weight of the world on his shoulders. He took Alice on beach walks, made breakfast even though his cooking skills were still a disaster, and made sure to enjoy every moment with her. And Alice was happy. Even without grand promises, she knew he loved her. But then, one day, David proved he could still surprise her. It was the perfect late afternoon. The sky showed shades of orange and pink. The sound of the waves gently breaking on the sand created a peaceful melody. David asked Alice to meet him on the beach. When she arrived, her heart nearly stopped. There was a path of candles lighting up the sand, flower petals scattered around, and right in the middle, David stood, wearing a white shirt open at the chest, holding something small in his hands. Alice held her breath. She knew what was about to happen, but her heart raced like never before. David smiled as he saw her approach. He took her hands, his eyes shining with emotion. "Since the day you came into my life, everything has changed. You turned my boring routine into something unpredictable, messed everything up, and made me feel again." Alice felt tears threatening to fall. David took a deep breath before continuing. "I spent so much time running from love, thinking it would make me weak. But then, you came along and showed me that love doesn't destroy me. On the contrary, it completes me." He kneeled down. Alice put her hands to her mouth, trying to hold back the tears. David opened the velvet box, revealing a stunning ring with a delicate, sparkling stone. "Alice Martins, you are the one thing I don't want to lose. Will you marry me?" Alice sobbed. The whole world seemed to stop around them. Her heart was beating so fast, she thought she might faint. But deep down, the answer had always been within her. Yes, 1,000 times yes. David smiled before standing up and pulling her into a deep kiss, full of emotion. Alice felt complete, and for the first time in his life, David was exactly where he was supposed to be, by her side. The wedding took place a few weeks later, in an intimate seaside ceremony. Alice chose a light, delicate dress with soft lace that seemed to float in the wind. David wore an elegant suit, but without a tie, keeping the relaxed, passionate vibe of that day. The altar was decorated with white flowers and soft lights, creating a magical atmosphere. Alice walked down the aisle barefoot on the sand, her heart racing with every step. David was waiting for her at the altar, his eyes full of emotion, as if he were seeing the most beautiful thing in the world. And to him, Alice was exactly that. The officiant began the ceremony, but Alice could only focus on David's eyes. When it was time for the vows, David took her hands and smiled. "I've never been good with words. I spent my life running from feelings, thinking they were a risk. But then you appeared, and showed me that the biggest risk was living without love." Alice bit her lip, trying to hold back the tears. David squeezed her hands a little tighter. "Today I promise you that I won't run anymore. I promise to stay every day for the rest of our lives." Alice felt tears stream down her face, but they weren't from sadness. They were from happiness, from certainty, from love. Then it was her turn. "David, when we first met, I never imagined we'd be here one day. But from the moment you entered my life, I knew something had changed forever." She smiled, her heart overflowing with emotion. "You tried to run from love, but in the end, it found you. And I promise that from now on, I'll never let you doubt that." David let out a small, emotional laugh. The officiant smiled before concluding, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss the bride." David didn't hesitate. He pulled Alice close and kissed her with all the love he had kept hidden for so long. And in that moment, they both knew. Nothing could ever separate them again. The reception was held under the stars. There was an improvised dance floor in the sand, lights hung between palm trees, and soft music playing in the background. David and Alice danced together, their bodies close, hearts beating in unison. "I still can't believe I got to marry you," David whispered in her ear. Alice laughed. "Well, believe it. You're officially a married man now." He twirled her slowly on the dance floor, his eyes full of longing and affection. "And I can't wait to spend every second of my life by your side." Alice smiled, feeling happier than she ever imagined. Then, amidst the lights, the music, and the sound of the waves in the distance, David pulled her into a long kiss. It was the beginning of a new life. A life of love, of togetherness, of endless happiness. And in that moment, they both knew they were exactly where they were meant to be. Together. Forever. What did you think of David and Alice's story? Leave your thoughts in the comments. On a scale from 0 to 10, what would you rate this story? Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell to follow all of our stories. And feel free to watch more emotional stories by clicking here on the final screen.